Everyone in the city believed that if a mafia boss forced you into his car, your future had already been decided. They were wrong. Rain hammered against the sidewalks of Manhattan as Naomi Carter stepped out of the luxury townhouse with a canvas grocery bag hanging from her shoulder and the collar of her faded coat pulled high against the cold October wind. The mansion behind her glowed with warm golden light, but she never looked back. Housemaids weren't supposed to admire the places they cleaned. They were supposed to disappear before anyone noticed they had ever been there. Naomi had mastered that invisible existence months ago. She walked with quiet steps, kept her eyes lowered, and smiled only when spoken to. It was safer that way. The city swallowed invisible people without asking questions, and sometimes that felt like mercy. She tightened her grip on the grocery bag as a sharp ache spread across her side. The pain arrived without warning, stealing her breath for only a second before she forced herself to keep walking. No one passing beneath umbrellas noticed the tiny pause. No one ever did. 3 blocks away, headlights cut through the rain before a black SUV rolled silently to the curb directly beside her. The engine never turned off. The rear passenger door swung open with deliberate precision. Naomi froze. Every story she had overheard from kitchen staff echoed through her mind. Black SUVs, tailored suits, men who never raised their voices because they never needed to. She took one careful step backward. A tall man stepped out from the vehicle, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that fit him with effortless perfection. Rain gathered on his dark hair before sliding across the sharp lines of his face. Dominic Castellano carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had never once questioned whether the world would obey him. His blue eyes settled on Naomi with unsettling focus. She lowered hers immediately. "Mr. Castellano," she whispered, "if I made a mistake at work, I'm sorry." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the grocery bag, set it gently inside the SUV, and held the open door. "Get in." The words were quiet, almost polite. Somehow, that made them harder to refuse. Naomi's heartbeat thundered louder than the rain. "Sir, I have to catch the subway." "Not tonight." She glanced toward the empty street. People hurried past without looking. Yellow taxis splashed through puddles. Life continued as though nothing unusual was happening. She realized something that frightened her more than the black SUV itself. No one was coming. No one even knew she needed help. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse until they ached. "Please," she managed softly. "Did I do something wrong?" Dominic's expression never changed. There was no anger in his face. No impatience. Only an unreadable stillness that seemed heavier than the storm surrounding them. After several endless seconds, Naomi climbed into the leather seat. The door closed with a muted click, sealing away the sound of the rain. Warm air filled the cabin. The city lights blurred across the tinted windows as the SUV pulled away from the curb. Naomi kept both hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid even to breathe too loudly. Dominic remained silent beside her, watching the streets instead of her face. The silence stretched so long that she began imagining every possible reason she had been brought here. Had she broken something? Heard something she shouldn't? Failed some invisible test she never knew existed? Then, without looking at her, Dominic spoke in a voice so calm it barely rose above the hum of the engine. "Naomi." She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." He finally turned toward her, his eyes lingering not on her frightened face, but on the way she unconsciously protected one side of her body every time the car shifted over a bump. His next question was almost gentle. "Who broke your ribs?" 3 weeks earlier, Naomi Carter had arrived at the Castellano residence carrying everything she owned inside 2 worn duffel bags and a determination she refused to let anyone take from her. The mansion towered above the quiet street like a private museum built from polished limestone and endless windows, every surface reflecting success that seemed impossibly distant from the life she had known. She remembered stopping at the front gate for exactly 5 seconds, telling herself that this job was not a miracle. It was simply another chance to survive. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the estate manager, welcomed her with professional courtesy and a list of rules that sounded more like lessons in invisibility than housekeeping. Arrive before sunrise. Leave every room exactly as you found it. Never interrupt a meeting. Never ask personal questions. Never enter the private office unless instructed. Above all, remember that discretion was more valuable than perfection. Naomi listened carefully, nodded politely, and memorized every word because she could not afford to lose another opportunity. By 6 o'clock every morning, she was already polishing marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers hanging 30 feet overhead. She dusted shelves lined with first edition books, folded towels softer than anything she had ever owned, and arranged fresh flowers that arrived every other day from a florist whose weekly invoice exceeded her monthly grocery budget. She admired nothing. She touched everything with care, but claimed nothing with her eyes. That had always been her way. The other employees barely knew her beyond her name. During lunch, she usually sat alone near the laundry room with homemade sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, while the cooks exchanged neighborhood gossip and the security staff debated baseball scores. She smiled whenever someone greeted her, but conversations ended quickly because Naomi had become skilled at answering questions without revealing pieces of herself. No one knew she rented a tiny apartment in the Bronx with unreliable heat. No one knew she skipped dinners some evenings to send money to her younger sister in Atlanta. No one knew why she occasionally stopped moving for just a second before lifting heavy laundry baskets, or why she quietly pressed one hand against her side whenever she believed no one was watching. She always recovered before anyone could ask if she was all right. Every evening, she left through the staff entrance carrying the same canvas grocery bag, walking the 6 blocks to the subway, because saving $4 on transportation mattered more than arriving home quickly. Once, while organizing books inside the private library, she noticed Dominic Castellano standing near the window speaking softly into his phone. She immediately lowered her eyes and turned away, expecting him to continue the conversation as though she did not exist. Instead, after several silent seconds, she sensed his gaze following her careful movements across the room. She never looked back. She finished dusting the shelves, straightened a picture frame by less than an inch, and quietly disappeared. From that day forward, Naomi began noticing something unusual. Whenever she entered a room, Dominic rarely spoke to her, yet he always seemed aware of where she was. If she carried a heavy box, he paused for the briefest moment before continuing down the hallway. If she reached for something on a high shelf, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Naomi assumed she was imagining it. Powerful men did not notice invisible women. She had built her entire life around that certainty. She had no idea that someone had already begun paying attention to the small details she worked so hard to hide. Over the following days, Dominic Castellano stopped trusting coincidence. He had built an empire by noticing details other people dismissed, and Naomi Carter had become a collection of details that refused to fit together. Every morning she arrived exactly 5 minutes before sunrise with neatly pressed uniforms and the same quiet smile that never quite reached her eyes. Every evening she left carrying the same faded canvas bag, never accepting rides from coworkers, never complaining, never asking for favors. She moved through the mansion with remarkable grace, yet there were moments when that graceful rhythm disappeared. If she reached too quickly for a stack of folded linens, her breathing caught for a heartbeat before she forced herself forward. When she carried fresh flower arrangements into the dining room, she always shifted the weight to her left side, as though protecting the right, without realizing anyone might notice. One afternoon, Dominic stood in the library reviewing financial reports while Naomi dusted the bookshelves nearby. She stretched toward the highest shelf, paused halfway, then quietly stepped onto a small ladder instead of extending her arm the rest of the way. It was an unnecessary extra step. Most people would have reached another 6 inches. She would not. Dominic pretended to keep reading, but the pattern stayed with him. Later that week, the head chef accidentally dropped a heavy stockpot in the kitchen. The sharp metallic crash startled everyone. Naomi flinched harder than anyone else. Her hand instinctively pressed against her side before she realized what she was doing. She quickly picked up a dish towel and continued wiping the counter as though nothing had happened. The cooks exchanged jokes about the noise. No one else seemed to notice. Dominic did. Another morning, he watched from the upstairs balcony while staff members prepared the ballroom for a charity reception. 2 employees struggled to move a wooden banquet table. Before anyone could ask, Naomi stepped forward to help. She smiled politely, placed both hands beneath the edge, and lifted only for a second before quietly stepping back with an apology that she was feeling lightheaded. Someone laughed kindly and told her not to worry because the security team would handle it. Naomi thanked them, but embarrassment lingered across her face long after everyone else forgot the moment. Dominic never forgot it. There was also the medicine. Every afternoon at precisely 3:15, Naomi excused herself for exactly 2 minutes. She never lingered. She never carried prescription bottles openly. She simply returned with a glass of water and continued working as though nothing had interrupted her day. One evening, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks casually mentioned that Naomi had declined the estate physician's offer of a routine wellness examination. She said she was perfectly healthy, Mrs. Brooks explained while reviewing staff schedules. Dominic looked up from the paperwork. Did she seem convincing? Mrs. Brooks hesitated before answering. She seemed determined. That single word settled heavily in the room. Determined people often carried burdens they believed belonged to them alone. Dominic had spent most of his life surrounded by lies told for money, ambition, or power. Naomi's silence felt different. It was not hiding guilt. It was protecting pain. He did not know what had happened before she walked through the gates of his estate 3 weeks earlier, but every quiet gesture, every guarded movement, every carefully concealed wince told the same story. Someone had taught her that enduring hardship without asking for help was safer than trusting another human being. And for reasons he could not yet explain, Dominic found himself unable to look away from the invisible weight she carried every single day. Friday evenings transformed the Castellano estate into a carefully choreographed performance. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, staff members moved through polished hallways with practiced precision, and the soft glow of chandeliers reflected across marble floors that looked untouched despite dozens of footsteps passing every hour. Naomi Carter spent most of the evening refreshing floral arrangements and collecting empty crystal glasses after a private charity dinner attended by influential guests. She smiled politely whenever someone thanked her and quietly disappeared before conversations shifted toward subjects that did not belong to her world. By the time the last guest departed, the mansion finally exhaled into silence. Naomi gathered a stack of neatly folded table linens and headed toward the service corridor. The house felt different after midnight. Without the voices and music, every footstep echoed softly against stone walls. She paused near the laundry room, placing the linens on a counter as she closed her eyes for only a moment. The long day had settled into every muscle she possessed. She drew one slow breath, reached for the stack again, and accidentally brushed a single towel onto the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, a sudden wave of discomfort crossed her face before she caught herself against the counter. She remained perfectly still until the feeling passed. Then she smiled to herself, almost apologetically, as though asking her own body for one more hour of cooperation. She never realized someone had seen everything. Dominic had returned unexpectedly after finishing a late business meeting across town. Crossing the second-floor balcony, he happened to glance toward the open service hallway below. He was too far away to hear anything, but the scene unfolding beneath him needed no words. He watched Naomi pause before bending only halfway toward the towel, hesitating as if calculating whether the simple movement was worth the discomfort. Instead of crouching farther, she carefully lowered herself 1 inch at a time until she could reach it without twisting her upper body. It was not clumsiness. It was adaptation. Someone who had lived with lingering pain long enough to memorize every movement. Dominic remained motionless behind the balcony railing. When Naomi finally stood again, she rested one hand lightly against the edge of the counter before continuing down the hallway carrying the linens exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. Anyone else would have forgotten the moment within seconds. Dominic could not. Later that night, he walked through the now empty service corridor alone. The folded towel still rested in perfect alignment on the shelf where Naomi had placed it. Nothing appeared out of order. Yet the image refused to leave his mind. He remembered every tiny hesitation, every controlled breath, every deliberate movement she had made to avoid placing pressure on one side of her body. It was the behavior of someone protecting an injury that should have healed long ago, but somehow had not. Back inside his study, he poured a cup of black coffee instead of the expensive whiskey waiting on the shelf behind his desk. The security reports lay open before him, but he found himself staring through them rather than reading them. After several quiet minutes, he pressed the intercom. "Have Mrs. Brooks send me Naomi Carter's employment file first thing tomorrow morning." The assistant acknowledged the request without asking questions. Dominic ended the call and looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows as rain began falling over Manhattan once again. His instincts had protected him through years of impossible decisions, and those instincts were now telling him something that refused to be ignored. Naomi Carter was not simply hiding exhaustion. She was hiding a story that began long before she ever stepped through the gates of his home, and for the first time in years, Dominic decided that discovering the truth mattered more than any business waiting on his desk. The employment file arrived on Dominic Castellano's desk at exactly 7:30 the next morning. It was remarkably thin. One page of references, proof of employment eligibility, a background check that revealed nothing beyond a series of ordinary addresses, and an application written in careful handwriting that listed years of housekeeping experience across New York City. Everything about the file suggested an ordinary woman trying to earn an honest living. Everything Dominic had observed suggested there was far more to the story. He closed the folder and pressed a button on his desk. Within minutes, Michael Russo, the trusted head of his security team, stepped quietly into the office. Dominic slid the folder across the polished wood without saying a word. Michael opened it, glanced through the pages, then looked back with a questioning expression. "I need answers," Dominic said calmly. "Not rumors. Facts." Michael nodded once. "You want a complete background? Only what explains why someone who works this hard looks like she expects every day to become the worst day of her life." There was no anger in Dominic's voice, only quiet certainty. Michael understood immediately. By late afternoon, the first pieces of information began arriving. Naomi rented a modest apartment in the Bronx under her own name. Her rent had never been late despite a modest salary. Utility payments were always on time. She had no criminal record, no outstanding debts, and no history of workplace complaints. Every former employer described her using nearly identical words: reliable, honest, quiet, respectful. Dominic listened without interrupting, but he knew the report was still incomplete. "Keep going," he said. Michael returned the following evening carrying another folder, noticeably thicker than the first. "There is something unusual," he explained. "Every month, nearly half of her paycheck is transferred to an account in Atlanta, Georgia." Dominic remained silent. "The account belongs to her younger sister. She is attending nursing school." Michael continued turning pages. "Naomi has been paying tuition, housing costs, and textbooks for almost 2 years." Dominic lowered his eyes to the report. The numbers told their own story. There was almost nothing left for Naomi after supporting another household. Yet she had never requested overtime, never asked for advances, and never complained about long hours. Michael hesitated before speaking again. "There is one more thing." Dominic looked up. Her previous landlord mentioned that she moved unexpectedly about 4 months ago. No police reports were filed. No legal disputes. The landlord only remembered that she seemed determined to leave quickly and refused assistance carrying her belongings. Dominic leaned back in his chair, staring through the office windows as evening sunlight reflected against neighboring skyscrapers. The report still contained no dramatic revelation, yet the empty spaces between the facts spoke louder than the facts themselves. A woman who sacrificed nearly everything for her sister. A woman who avoided doctors despite obvious discomfort. A woman who changed apartments without explanation. A woman who smiled every day while carefully hiding the effort required simply to move. None of those choices belonged to someone seeking sympathy. They belonged to someone protecting everyone except herself. Dominic closed the folder slowly. "Stop looking through records," he said at last. Michael frowned slightly. "You think we have enough?" Dominic shook his head. "No. Paperwork cannot explain a person's eyes." He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the estate grounds below, where staff members crossed the gardens beneath the fading light. Naomi was among them, carrying a basket of freshly folded towels with the same steady determination she displayed every day. She laughed softly at something one of the gardeners said before continuing toward the guest house, and for a brief moment, the weight she carried seemed almost invisible. Dominic watched until she disappeared around the corner. He realized then that the truth he was searching for would never be found inside a file. It would only be revealed when someone finally gave Naomi a reason to believe she no longer had to carry it alone. The warmth inside the SUV felt strangely unfamiliar to Naomi Carter. Outside, Rain continued tracing silver lines across the windows while Manhattan drifted past in soft blurs of light. But inside the cabin, everything remained still. Dominic Castellano did not repeat his question. He did not demand an answer or fill the silence with assumptions. He simply waited, his attention resting not on her frightened expression but on the quiet exhaustion she had been carrying for far too long. Naomi lowered her eyes to her folded hands. For several seconds, she could not find her voice. She had become so accustomed to hiding every difficult part of her life that even the possibility of telling the truth felt unfamiliar. Finally, she whispered, "It is not important." Dominic answered without hesitation, "If it still hurts, it is important." Those 7 words settled over the silence more gently than she expected. She had prepared herself for criticism, disappointment, or questions about her work. Compassion had never entered her imagination. She attempted a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. "I can still do my job." Dominic nodded once. "I know you can." His calm reply surprised her even more. There was no accusation in his tone, only certainty. "You arrive early every morning. You stay late without being asked. Everyone who works for me says the same thing. They trust you." Naomi stared at the passing city lights, unsure why hearing those simple observations made her eyes sting. No one had ever described her that way before. Reliable, trusted, worth noticing. The driver quietly guided the vehicle onto a quieter avenue before stopping outside a small private medical office that occupied the first floor of a restored brownstone. The sign beside the entrance displayed only the physician's name without advertisements or bright lights. Dominic noticed Naomi looking through the window. "You are not in trouble," he said softly, "and no one here will force you to do anything." She looked back at him with visible uncertainty. "Then why am I here?" He paused for a moment before answering. "Because someone spent a very long time pretending to be all right." Naomi felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to tremble. She had repeated those same words to herself every morning while tying her apron, every evening while climbing the subway stairs, every night before falling asleep in her small apartment. "I am all right." If she believed it long enough, perhaps everyone else would as well. Dominic opened the door and stepped out into the light rain, then waited beside the vehicle instead of reaching for her or rushing her decision. The gesture was small, yet it carried unexpected respect. Naomi slowly followed him onto the sidewalk. The cool air filled her lungs as she glanced toward the entrance of the clinic. She could still walk away if she wanted. No one blocked the street. No one ordered her forward. Dominic stood several feet away with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, giving her space she had not realized she needed. "You have spent weeks making certain everyone around you felt comfortable," he said quietly. "For one evening, let someone make certain that you are." Naomi looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for hidden motives and finding only patience. Something inside her shifted almost imperceptibly. It was not complete trust. That would take far longer than a single conversation. But for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to believe that accepting kindness did not always come with a price. The waiting room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cedarwood instead of antiseptic, and soft jazz drifted quietly from hidden speakers as though the building itself had been designed to help people lower the burdens they carried before speaking a single word. Naomi Carter sat near the window with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of warm tea that had already grown cold. She had not taken a single sip. Across the room, Dominic Castellano remained seated several chairs away, deliberately giving her the distance she seemed to need. He answered 2 brief telephone calls, postponed an evening meeting without explanation, and returned his attention to the rain sliding slowly across the glass. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Naomi finally broke the silence. "My sister does not know." Dominic turned toward her without interrupting. Naomi lowered her eyes to the untouched cup. "She believes I have been working too many hours. I wanted her to focus on school instead of worrying about me." Her voice remained steady, but every sentence sounded as though it had been carried for months before finally finding its way into the open. "She is going to become a nurse next spring. She has worked too hard to lose that dream because of my problems." Dominic nodded gently. "You have protected her." Naomi smiled faintly. "I tried." Another quiet moment settled between them before she continued. "Sometimes protecting someone means they never see how much it costs." The words lingered in the room. Dominic understood them better than she realized. He had spent years making difficult decisions so others could sleep peacefully without knowing what had been sacrificed on their behalf. Yet hearing those words from Naomi carried a different weight because her sacrifices had never brought recognition or influence. They had simply allowed someone she loved to keep moving forward. She slowly drew a careful breath. A few months ago, I slipped while helping someone move furniture. She spoke without drama, almost apologetically, as though she regretted creating inconvenience rather than remembering the difficult day itself. I thought I would recover after a little rest, but I never stopped working long enough to let myself heal completely. Dominic listened without questioning the details she was not ready to share. What mattered most was not how the discomfort had begun, but how long she had believed she deserved to carry it alone. Naomi looked toward the rain outside. Every week, I told myself I would schedule an appointment. Then another bill arrived. Another tuition payment. Another reason to wait. She laughed softly at herself, though there was little joy in the sound. Eventually, waiting became a habit. Dominic leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. You know what I noticed first? Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. It was not the way you protected your side. She frowned slightly. Then what was it? He smiled almost imperceptibly. You apologized every time your body reminded you that it needed care. Naomi stared at him, surprised. He continued in the same calm voice. You apologized when you paused. You apologized when you lifted less than everyone else. You apologized for existing as though taking up space required permission. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. No one had ever described her life with such simple accuracy. She had spent so many years trying not to burden anyone that she had forgotten kindness was never supposed to be earned through suffering. As the physician quietly opened the office door and invited Naomi inside, she rose slowly from her chair. Before taking a single step, she looked back at Dominic. For the first time since they had met, she did not see a man defined by reputation or power. She saw someone who had looked beyond her silence and recognized the dignity she had almost forgotten belonged to her all along. The examination lasted less than 40 minutes, but when Naomi Carter stepped back into the waiting room, something about her expression had already begun to change. The physician had spoken with quiet reassurance, explaining that while she needed time, proper care, and a period of lighter physical activity, there was every reason to expect improvement if she finally allowed herself to heal instead of enduring discomfort in silence. For the first time in months, someone had given her permission to stop pretending she was invincible. She held a small folder containing treatment instructions against her chest, as though it were far more valuable than the paper inside. Dominic rose from his chair without asking what the doctor had said. He simply looked at her face and noticed that the tension she had carried for weeks had softened ever so slightly. As they walked back toward the waiting SUV, Naomi spoke first. I do not know how to thank you. Dominic opened the passenger door before answering. Do not thank me for reminding you that your health matters. During the drive back through the glowing streets of Manhattan, neither of them felt the need to fill every silence. The city lights reflected across rain-soaked pavement while storefronts prepared to close for the night. Naomi watched families carrying shopping bags, friends laughing beneath shared umbrellas, and couples waiting patiently for traffic lights to change. The ordinary moments suddenly seemed extraordinary because she realized how long it had been since she had allowed herself to imagine an ordinary future. When they arrived at the estate, Dominic invited her into his study instead of sending her directly home. The room was warm with the scent of cedar bookshelves and freshly brewed coffee. He placed a simple folder on the desk between them. This is not a reward, he said calmly, and it is not charity. Naomi looked at him with uncertainty as he continued. Beginning Monday, your schedule will change. Fewer physically demanding assignments. The same salary. Mrs. Brooks will arrange additional staff where needed. Naomi immediately shook her head. I cannot accept less work for the same pay. Dominic met her eyes with quiet confidence. You are not accepting less work. You are accepting the opportunity to recover so you can continue building the life you have worked so hard to create. She lowered her gaze, unable to argue with words that carried neither pity nor obligation. Dominic then slid a second envelope toward her. Your sister's next tuition payment has already been covered through a private education foundation that supports future nurses. Naomi looked up in surprise. I cannot repay something like that. Dominic smiled faintly. No one asked you to. Tears gathered in her eyes before she quickly brushed them away. Throughout her life, every favor had arrived attached to expectations. Every kindness had required something in return. This one asked only that she continue believing in her own future. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks quietly entered with a small set of apartment keys. "The guest cottage on the estate has been empty for months," she said warmly. "It is closer to work, has fewer stairs, and the kitchen is fully stocked. Stay there until you are completely well." Naomi looked from Mrs. Brooks to Dominic, overwhelmed by generosity she had never requested. Dominic simply nodded once. "You have spent enough time proving your strength," he said. "Now prove that you also know how to accept support." Naomi held the keys gently in her hand, as though they unlocked far more than a quiet place to sleep. For the first time in many years, the road ahead no longer looked like something she had to survive alone. It looked like a future she was finally allowed to enter with hope instead of fear. 6 months passed with remarkable quiet. Winter surrendered to spring, and the gardens surrounding the Castellano estate filled once again with color that Naomi Carter had been too exhausted to notice the previous year. Now she crossed the same stone walkways with an unhurried confidence that felt entirely new. The careful instructions from her physician had become daily habits instead of temporary obligations. She no longer apologized when she needed to slow down. She no longer believed that caring for herself meant disappointing everyone else. The guest cottage had gradually become a true home, filled with framed photographs of her younger sister in nursing school, fresh flowers from the estate gardens, and books she finally had time to read in the evenings. Her laughter, once so rare that people struggled to remember hearing it, now drifted through the hallways often enough that the kitchen staff smiled whenever she entered the room. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks noticed first that Naomi had stopped walking like someone waiting for the next difficult moment. The gardeners noticed that she lingered outside during lunch simply to enjoy warm sunshine. Even the security team remarked that she greeted everyone by name instead of quietly slipping past them. The greatest change, however, appeared in the smallest moments. She no longer instinctively protected one side of her body whenever she reached for something on a shelf. She moved naturally because she no longer expected every ordinary motion to carry hidden discomfort. One bright Saturday afternoon, the estate hosted a scholarship luncheon for local nursing students. Dominic Castellano stood near the entrance greeting guests while staff members prepared refreshments across the courtyard. Naomi helped arrange tables covered with white linen beneath flowering trees, working carefully but without hesitation. As the first students arrived, one young woman rushed across the lawn and wrapped Naomi in a joyful embrace. It was her sister, dressed proudly in the white uniform of a newly graduated nurse. Tears filled Naomi's eyes as they laughed together beneath the spring sunlight. Dominic watched the reunion from a respectful distance without interrupting. Mrs. Brooks quietly stepped beside him. "She looks different," she said softly. Dominic nodded. She remembers who she was before life convinced her to disappear. Later that afternoon, after the guests had departed and the estate settled into peaceful silence, Naomi found Dominic standing alone near the garden fountain. The water reflected the golden light of sunset across the stone paths where they had both walked countless times. She approached with a gentle smile that no longer carried uncertainty. "There is something I never said," she began. Dominic looked toward her. "You do not owe me anything." Naomi shook her head. "This is not because I owe you. It is because it is true." She paused before continuing. "You were the first person who looked at me and saw more than someone who could clean a room." Dominic smiled quietly. "I only noticed what was already there." Naomi glanced toward the gardens where her sister was laughing with other guests. "No," she answered gently. "You noticed what I had forgotten was there." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming roses through the courtyard while the fountain continued its quiet rhythm. Nothing dramatic happened. No applause echoed through the estate. No grand speeches celebrated what had changed. There was only a woman who had regained her confidence, a man who had chosen compassion over assumption, and a future built not on fear, but on dignity. As the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, Naomi walked toward her sister with steady steps and an open smile, and Dominic watched her go with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that true strength was never measured by the power to command another person. It was measured by the willingness to restore hope without asking for recognition. And on that peaceful evening, everyone who crossed those gardens could have seen what dignity truly looked like.